At 7:04 a.m. on November 8, 1942, Captain Francis Smith stood on the bridge of USS Massachusetts and gave the order his gunners had been waiting months to hear commence firing. 400 yards behind him, Massachusetts's forward turrets, Turret 1 and Turret 2 elevated to 25 degrees. 9 16-inch guns, each weighing over 100 tons and measuring 66 feet in length, trained on the incomplete French battleship Gilberts, sitting in Casablanca harbor 7 miles away. The fire control computer had calculated the solution range, bearing projectile trajectory, accounting for windship motion and Earth's rotation. At 7:05 a.m., Massachusetts fired. 9 shells, each weighing over a ton, left their barrels at 500 feet per second with a sound that shattered windows in Morocco 5 miles inland. The shells climbed to 45,000 feet higher than most aircraft could fly, arced over, and fell toward Gilberts. Spotters tracked their descent. Splashes erupted around the French battleship. Massachusetts had fired the first American 16-inch naval salvo in combat. The United States Navy's newest battleship in her first battle was dueling another battleship in a harbor defended by coastal batteries, submarines, and aircraft. For the next 3 days, Massachusetts would fight through Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, trading fire with shore batteries that could hit back engaging French warships that weren't enemies by choice, but were enemies by circumstance, and proving that the South Dakota-class battleships were everything their designers promised. This is the story of Massachusetts at Casablanca, the US Navy's first major surface action against Vichy France. The duel between modern battleships, where one could barely move and the other couldn't afford to stop, and the moment when American 16-inch guns roared in anger for the first time, announcing that the US Navy was bringing overwhelming firepower to a war that had already been grinding on for 3 years. Operation Torch was politically and militarily complex in ways that most wartime operations weren't. The target wasn't Germany or Italy, but French North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, controlled by the Vichy French government that collaborated with Nazi Germany following France's 1940 defeat. The Vichy military forces in North Africa weren't enthusiastic German allies, but they followed orders from a government that had aligned with the Axis. The Allies hoped French forces would offer minimal resistance or even switch sides once the invasion began. Intelligence suggested French officers might welcome liberation, but nobody knew for certain, and operational planning had to assume that French forces would fight. The Casablanca Task Force represented the largest American naval operation since World War I. Over 100 ships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and support vessels carried 35,000 American troops across the Atlantic for amphibious assaults at 3 locations along the Moroccan coast. Rear Admiral H. Kent Hewitt commanded the naval forces. Major General George S. Patton commanded the ground troops. Their objective was to secure Morocco's Atlantic ports, particularly Casablanca, to establish supply lines for future operations against Axis forces in North Africa. USS Massachusetts was the task force's most powerful ship. She'd been commissioned just 7 months earlier in May 1942, a South Dakota-class fast battleship designed to operate with carrier task forces while maintaining the firepower and protection to fight other battleships. She displaced 44,000 tons, fully loaded could make 27 knots, and mounted 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets. Her armor scheme protected against 16-inch shells at battle ranges. Her fire control systems represented the pinnacle of 1940s technology analog computers that could calculate firing solutions accounting for dozens of variables in seconds. She was the most modern, most capable battleship in the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet. Her crew numbered over 300 men, most with minimal combat experience. Massachusetts had conducted workup training exercises off the East Coast through summer and fall 1942, but firing at towed targets in peacetime conditions differed fundamentally from combat. The gun crews had never fired at a target that could shoot back. The damage control parties had never managed flooding and fires caused by actual combat damage. The bridge crew had never maneuvered under fire. Operation Torch would be their first test. The Casablanca defences were formidable. Coastal batteries mounting guns from 75mm to 194mm covered the harbour approaches. The incomplete battleship Gilberts sat pierside in the harbour, unable to move, but with her forward quadruple 15-inch turret operational. 8 destroyers and multiple submarines were based at Casablanca. Shore-based aircraft included fighters and reconnaissance planes. Intelligence estimated French forces would resist for 24 hours before negotiating surrender. This estimate proved optimistic. The political situation complicated engagement rules. The Allies wanted to minimize French casualties, hoping that limited bloodshed would facilitate French cooperation afterward. Orders specified that American forces would not fire unless fired upon. If French forces opened fire, American ships were authorized to return fire sufficient to neutralize threats, but should avoid unnecessary destruction. These restrictions placed Massachusetts in an awkward position. She was supposed to support amphibious landings, while not firing first, then respond proportionally if attacked. These weren't the engagement conditions her designers had anticipated. The approach to Casablanca began before dawn on November 8th. Massachusetts and her screening ships, heavy cruiser Tuscaloosa, and 4 destroyers approached from the northwest, positioning to bombard shore defences if French forces resisted. The amphibious assault forces were landing at beaches north and south of Casablanca. Initially, everything proceeded according to plan. Landing craft hit the beaches. Troops waded ashore. No resistance materialized. The optimistic intelligence projections seemed accurate. Then at 7:00 a.m., French coastal batteries opened fire on American ships approaching Casablanca harbour. The political calculation had been made. Vichy forces would resist. Within minutes, French destroyers sortied from the harbour to attack American transports. Gilberts' forward turret, which intelligence had reported as non-operational, opened fire on Massachusetts from her berth 7 miles away. The engagement restrictions evaporated. Massachusetts was cleared to engage. Captain Smith ordered general quarters. The ship had been at readiness condition to half the crew at battle stations in anticipation of possible action. Now every station manned, every system active, every gun loaded. Fire control radar tracked Gilberts. The main battery director computed firing solutions. Turret 1 and Turret 2 trained toward the target. Turret 3 would remain masked, unable to fire forward without risk of blast effects damaging Massachusetts' superstructure. At 7:05 a.m., Massachusetts fired her first salvo, 6 16-inch shells from Turret 1 and Turret 2. The guns recoiled 4 feet, their massive breech mechanisms cycling to reload even before the previous shells reached their target. The blast pressure was immense. Anyone on deck within 100 feet of the guns would suffer ruptured eardrums or worse. The concussion shattered light fixtures inside the ship and knocked instruments off their mounts. This was expected. 16-inch guns weren't designed for comfort, but for throwing 1-ton shells 20 miles with precision. The first salvo fell short, shell splashes erupting in the water between Massachusetts and Gilberts. Fire control adjusted. The second salvo, fired 40 seconds later, landed closer. The third salvo scored hits. Spotters observed explosions on Gilberts' superstructure. Massachusetts continued firing, settling into a rhythm salvo every 40 seconds, 9 shells downrange, adjusting based on spotter corrections. The engagement became a demonstration of American fire control superiority. Massachusetts was maneuvering at 20 knots, firing at a target 7 miles away, and landing hits with regularity that would have been impossible without radar-assisted fire control. Gilberts returned fire gamely, but was at a severe disadvantage. She was incomplete, unable to move, with only her forward turret operational. Her fire control systems lacked radar. She was shooting at a moving target using optical range-finding alone possible, but far less accurate than radar ranging. Her shells fell around Massachusetts, some close enough that splashes drenched the deck, but she couldn't seem to hit. The duel was unequal. a completed modern maneuvering battleship with radar fire control against an incomplete stationary battleship using World War I-era fire control methods. But Gilberts wasn't Massachusetts' only problem. French coastal batteries, particularly the L. Hank battery, mounting 4 194mm guns, were firing at American ships with accuracy that suggested experienced crews and good fire control. Shells landed close to Massachusetts, forcing evasive maneuvers. Heavy cruiser Tuscaloosa took a hit that damaged her deck but caused no casualties. Destroyers screening the battleship maneuvered frantically to avoid shells from multiple batteries. The engagement that had started as a battleship duel became a general action, with Massachusetts engaging Gilberts coastal batteries and occasionally French destroyers attempting to escape the harbour. The gun crews worked with mechanical precision. Each 16-inch gun required a crew of nearly 100 men in the turrets, loading shells and powder charges, men in the magazines below decks, handling ammunition, men in fire control computing solutions, men spotting fall of shot and calling corrections. The cycle repeated continuously. Fire, reload, adjust fire again. The heat inside the turrets was intense despite ventilation. Powder residue fouled the air. The noise was beyond description. Even with sound-powered headsets and earplugs, the concussion of firing was physically painful. At 8:00 a.m., Massachusetts shifted fire to the L. Hank battery, which had been scoring near misses consistently. The challenge was different than engaging Gilberts. Shore batteries were smaller targets, harder to spot, often partially concealed by terrain or fortifications. But 16-inch shells were devastating against fixed fortifications. Massachusetts fired several salvos, walking her shells across the battery position. Spotter aircraft reported direct hits and secondary explosions. The battery ceased firing, either destroyed or deciding discretion was preferable to continuing to attract the attention of a battleship. Through the morning, Massachusetts divided her attention between multiple targets. Gilberts continued firing sporadically, though her rate of fire decreased, possibly from damage, possibly from ammunition concerns. French destroyers attempted to escape the harbour but were engaged by American destroyers and forced back or sunk. Coastal batteries fired opportunistically whenever American ships came within range. Massachusetts responded to each threat methodically, using her main battery against the most dangerous targets and her secondary 5-inch guns against smaller vessels and shore positions. The political complexity of the engagement weighed on everyone involved. These weren't Germans or Japanese. They were fighting. They were French forces who'd been allies until 1940 and might be allies again if the invasion succeeded. Every shell fired at Gilberts or coastal batteries was killing Frenchmen who were following orders from a government that circumstances had forced into collaboration. But operational necessity overrode political considerations. French forces were shooting at American ships and killing American sailors. The response had to be proportional and effective, regardless of political complications. At 10:15 a.m., Massachusetts scored a critical hit on Gilberts. A 16-inch shell penetrated the French battleship's forward turret, causing a massive internal explosion. The turret was wrecked, its guns disabled, fires raging. Gilberts ceased firing. Without her operational turret, she was a target rather than a threat. Massachusetts shifted fire to remaining coastal batteries and continued supporting the amphibious operations. The first day's engagement lasted until early afternoon. French resistance gradually diminished as shore batteries were knocked out or ceased firing. The amphibious assaults secured their beaches. American forces moved inland. By evening, Casablanca's defenses were suppressed though not eliminated. Massachusetts anchored offshore, her crew at reduced readiness, but prepared for renewed action if French forces counterattacked. The next 2 days brought sporadic engagements. French submarines attempted attacks, but were driven off by destroyers. Shore batteries that had survived the first day's bombardment fired occasionally, drawing response from Massachusetts or cruisers. French aircraft conducted reconnaissance but didn't attack. The overwhelming American air superiority made offensive operations suicidal. Gilberts, her turret destroyed, sat silent in the harbour. The battle was effectively over, but the political situation remained unclear. French commanders were negotiating while some units continued resisting. On November 10th, a ceasefire was arranged. Admiral François Darlan, the senior Vichy official in North Africa, ordered French forces to stop resisting. The political machinations that enabled this ceasefire were complex and controversial. Darlan was a collaborator with dubious legitimacy, but he commanded French forces and could order them to stand down. The Allies accepted his authority as a temporary expedient. French forces in Morocco ceased fire. American troops entered Casablanca. Operation Torch's Moroccan phase was complete. Massachusetts had fired 786 16-inch shells. During the 3-day engagement, approximately 40% of her total magazine capacity. Her guns needed relining. The barrels wore slightly with each shot, affecting accuracy after sustained firing. Her crew was exhausted 3 days at battle stations with minimal rest. But she'd accomplished her mission. Gilberts was disabled, coastal batteries were suppressed, French naval forces were neutralized, and the amphibious landings had succeeded with acceptable casualties. The battle's significance extended beyond the immediate tactical results. This was the US Navy's first major surface action since World War I, and its first engagement with modern battleships. The performance data generated during those 3 days informed fire control improvements, tactical doctrine, modifications, and training programs for crews on other battleships. Massachusetts had proven that South Dakota-class battleships could deliver accurate fire while maneuvering, that their armor protection was adequate against shore battery fire, and that their crews could function effectively in combat conditions. The engagement also validated the 16-inch gun as a naval weapon. The US Navy had debated gun calibers extensively during battleship design. 14-inch guns versus 16-inch versus the 18-inch monsters the Japanese were rumored to be mounting. The 16-inch .45 caliber gun represented a compromise between hitting power and practical considerations like weight, ammunition handling, and rate of fire. At Casablanca, the 16-inch gun proved its worth. The shells had range accuracy and destructive power. To engage any target Massachusetts encountered, the fire control systems could deliver those shells with precision at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. For Gilberts, the engagement was tragic. She'd been launched in 1940, evacuated to Casablanca before France's fall, and spent 2 years incomplete. Her crew had worked desperately to make her forward turret operational, achieving that goal just months before Operation Torch. She'd fought bravely against overwhelming odds, a stationary, incomplete battleship, engaging a fully operational opponent with superior fire control. She'd survived the engagement but was so damaged that she wouldn't return to service until after the war, when the French Navy completed her reconstruction. The French casualties from the 3-day battle exceeded 1,000 killed and wounded sailors aboard ships, soldiers in coastal batteries, civilians caught in bombardments. American casualties were lighter, but still significant, several hundred killed and wounded across all services. These men died in an engagement where neither side particularly wanted to fight, forced into combat by political circumstances beyond their control. The battle accomplished its strategic objectives, but at a human cost that both sides would have preferred to avoid. Massachusetts' crew emerged from Casablanca with confidence born from successful combat experience. They'd tested their ship against real opposition, fired her guns in anger, maneuvered under fire, and proven they could fight effectively. The nervous anticipation that precedes first combat had been replaced by knowledge of what combat actually entailed. This psychological transformation was as important as any tactical lesson learned. The battleship herself had performed flawlessly. Her machinery had operated continuously at high power for 3 days. Her guns had fired hundreds of shells without malfunction. Her armor had protected against the hits she'd taken. Several smaller shells had struck, causing minor damage, but no casualties. Her fire control had delivered accurate fire throughout the engagement. The South Dakota-class design had been validated in combat. Operation Torch's success opened the Mediterranean to Allied operations and began the campaign that would eventually drive Axis forces from North Africa. Massachusetts' role at Casablanca was crucial to that success. By neutralizing Gilberts and suppressing shore defenses, she'd enabled the amphibious landings that secured Morocco. The political complications of fighting Vichy forces were resolved when French commanders agreed to cease fire. The strategic objective, establishing bases for operations against Axis forces, was achieved. Massachusetts continued serving throughout the war, transferring to the Pacific, where she participated in virtually every major operation from 1943 through 1945. She bombarded Japanese positions at Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She screened carrier task forces during the major fleet actions. She survived kamikaze attacks and typhoons. She earned 11 battle stars, more than almost any other battleship. But Casablanca remained her defining moment, the first battle, the test, that proved her design, her crew, and her weapons. Looking back at the engagement, several aspects stand out. First, the technological superiority of American fire control made decisive difference. Massachusetts could accurately engage targets at ranges and under conditions that would have been impossible with optical fire control alone. Radar-ranging analog computers and trained crews transformed gunnery from an art to a science. Second, the complexity of engaging Vichy forces demonstrated that war isn't always clearly defined. Sometimes you fight people who aren't really enemies, but circumstances force them into opposition. Third, the scale of firepower that modern battleships could deliver was staggering: 786 shells, each weighing over a ton, fired with precision at targets miles away while maneuvering at 20 knots. The 16-inch gun's first use in American combat proved that weapon designers had made the right choice. The shells had enough hitting power to destroy any target. Massachusetts engaged battleships, cruisers, destroyers, shore fortifications. The range exceeded anything she faced. The rate of fire, one salvo every 40 seconds from each turret, allowed sustained bombardment that overwhelmed targets through volume as well as precision. Later in the war, these same guns would bombard Japanese positions from ranges where return fire was impossible, providing support that made amphibious assaults survivable. The human element remains most compelling. 2,300 men operated Massachusetts during that engagement: gunners loading shells, engineers maintaining machinery, fire control technicians, computing solutions, officers making tactical decisions, sailors performing hundreds of tasks that kept the ship functioning in combat. They trained for months, wondering if their training was adequate, hoping they'd perform well when tested. At Casablanca, they proved themselves capable. The nervous young sailors who'd approached Morocco became combat veterans by the time the ceasefire took effect. Captain Francis Smith's leadership during the engagement was exemplary. He'd maneuvered Massachusetts aggressively close to effective range, despite shore battery fire, and maintained fire discipline that allowed accurate shooting throughout the day. His decisions to shift targets to prioritize threats and to persist despite return fire demonstrated tactical judgment that would inform American battleship employment throughout the war. Smith went on to command other vessels and retired as an admiral, but he always credited his crew at Casablanca for making his tactical decisions look good. The image of Massachusetts firing that first salvo remains powerful: 9 16-inch guns roaring simultaneously, shells arcing across 7 miles to strike Gilberts, announcing that American naval power had arrived in force. The United States had been in the war for 11 months, but had fought mostly defensive actions or supporting roles. Casablanca was the beginning of American offensive operations, the first major battle where US forces took the initiative and imposed their will. Massachusetts symbolized that transition, a brand new battleship, mounting the most powerful guns in the American arsenal, fighting her first battle, and proving that American industry, American training, and American resolve could match anything the war demanded. 70 years after Casablanca, Massachusetts is a museum ship moored in Fall River, Massachusetts. Her guns are silent, her magazines empty, her crew long gone. But visitors walking her decks can stand where Captain Smith stood, look at the turrets that fired that first salvo, and imagine what it meant to be there on November 8, 1942, when the United States Navy's newest battleship fired her 16-inch guns in anger for the first time and announced that American sea power had entered the war with devastating force. The guns of Casablanca roared for 3 days, then fell silent. But their echoes carried across the Mediterranean, across the Pacific, to every theater where American forces would fight for the next 3 years. Massachusetts had proven what American battleships could do. Every subsequent bombardment, every engagement with enemy forces, every mission that required overwhelming firepower built on what she demonstrated at Casablanca. The first 16-inch salvo was also a promise that American industrial might translated into naval power would be brought to bear until victory was won. Massachusetts kept that promise through 3 more years of war, earning her place among the most distinguished warships in American naval history.